our hold on a second. Our lower brain is being activated. It shunts the energy that shunts away from our spiritual connection in order for our safety and security needs to be met. Okay, it's protective response, you know. So our lower level brain systems are primed to remember our stressful sensations. Remember back, you know, our safety systems are the most important, right? Historically and ancestrally, right? So we really need to make sure that we are taken care of on a safety and security level. I'm gonna get back to window intolerance in a minute.
Hey, Allie, we did get one question from the bishop.
Sure.
The definition of PTSD versus trauma versus just trauma.
Mm-hmm. So the question is, okay, so PTSD, I'm going to actually address that, PTSD or just trauma event. Okay. Yeah, let me address that in just a minute. So traumatic stress is stress on the body that activates or arouses our body system to fight, flight, freeze, right? For all of us who know what it is to kind of get to a point, like, you know, you're walking across the street. This is a stress response. This is not a trauma response, but a stress response. You're walking across the street and a car comes, you know, and almost cuts you off. You jump back. You don't think about that. That's an activation of your nervous system to get out of harm's way, right? So that is the lower level brain system protecting us, right? That's a flee response. That's a getting out, right? So what do we do after when we step back, the car goes by? Usually most of us go, oh. We exhale. That is the completion of the stress response. That's the going up into stress and then going down into relaxation. So afterward, we're kind of relaxed, right? That's just a small window into how activated we are. We're primed for that kind of behavior at all levels. And so if we've been traumatized, if we've had trauma in our lives, we'll have a higher level of activation to threat. So the withdrawal and disconnection and dissociation is another response to traumatic stress. It's the shutdown response. It's the response of zoning out. You know, it's this response of saying, I'm done, and it's too much, and shutting down. And a lot of us, you know, we feel that. We feel that certainly with COVID effects of just chronic stress can really get to that place of feeling like withdrawal and disconnection. And listen to that. Withdrawal and disconnection, that is the opposite of what we're trying to get to in spiritual care and connecting with folks in spirituality. So like how can we bring these together? The other thing I wanted to point out is that traumatic stress is contagious. So it is physiologically, we don't think about it. It's really important to know that. And, you know, we may understand that, like if we walk into a room, especially those of us who are empaths, we're a little bit more sensitive, we understand, like we walk into a room, we can feel the energy of the room, right? That's a kind of overt way of thinking about this. But in general, all of us have mirror neurons. We have neurological connections that, again, are protective. We used to live together, you know, in small communities for the vast majority of our human existence. And it was important for us to mirror each other so that we maintain safety. All right. So Vanderkolk talks about being in a trauma state means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma is still going on. It's the imprinting of the pain onto the spiritual self. And it really reorganizes the way you look about things. So the needs that are affected by trauma response are, and I mentioned this already, safety and security, right? Getting out of the car's way. That's a stress response out of, but connection and belonging, again, these are spiritual needs. So when we've been affected by trauma, and again, Bishop and the rest of us will talk about what that can look like. These are the 4 needs, human needs. They're actually bigger than food and water. There's research been shown that safety, security, especially connection and belonging, are just as important as food and water. So the types of trauma that's often seen in spiritual care, religious, institutions and organizations. So we see religious and spiritual trauma, we see generational trauma, we see collective trauma, and we see personal trauma. So we'll really briefly touch on these. This is beyond the scope of what we can do today, but we'll touch on it just for your information. Dr. Hillary McBride, researcher and author, she says that spiritual trauma is someone handing you an inner critic and telling you it's the voice of God. Spiritual trauma or religious trauma is based on the authoritarian enforced doctrines of toxic theology. It can be conspiracy-based. Cults are related to spiritual trauma. These are control-based systems, and usually authoritarian type of control that people do not have voice and choice within it. Religious trauma syndrome is another, it's a clinical syndrome that we do and we treat. It has cognitive, emotional, and cultural issues that arise from it. So, when people, all to say, like, if people, what often we see with people with religious and spiritual trauma is that they've experienced this, and you either see throw the baby out the bathwater, I'm done with spirituality, I'm done with religion, done. And then they find themselves in yoga communities or wellness communities that mirror the same exact authoritarian models. And so there's often, for people who've had relational trauma and issues related to religion, it's very complex. You can see patterns of this repeated. So it really goes down to the safety systems that can be maintained within spiritual care. All right, the next one is collective or intergenerational trauma. So this is a biggie. Collective trauma, one of the collective traumas we've all been through is COVID. Okay. That would be considered a collective trauma. Trauma is something we cannot control. It's outside of our ability to control our response to. So if our safety systems are, remember, safety, security, love, and belonging needs, were they met during, initial COVID times? For many of us, a lot of them took a big hit. For some of us, especially those in disadvantaged already, those who've had trauma before, major hit, right? So that's a historical trauma. And reactivity to these often is not conscious, So it takes a while. So going to the personal trauma, PTSD is just one, and it's single event trauma. So acute trauma would be something that happened, just like that you experienced one time, and you have to process that through therapy in order to resolve your stress response. So in PTSD, you have nightmares, you have like hyperarousal a lot, right? And so that acute stress needs to be tended to, so your body finds its safety system again. So chronic is a prolonged high stress response. So this is often for folks who are in military or provider, like what do they call it? Frontline providers, so that they're able to see stress and have a high stress response every single day, sometimes out of their own control, and therefore have their bodies get activated and aren't able to come down to relaxation response. Complex trauma, spiritual trauma is one of them, religious trauma is one of them. It's an invasive and interpersonal trauma. It's usually long-term. It's often connected to childhood. ACEs is something, I recommend most of us, who do spiritual care to understand what ACEs are. These are adverse childhood experiences, in part because this study is landmark. It continues to this day. Nadine Burke Harris out of California created this first long-term psychological empirical study on the consequences of adverse childhood experiences on our health outcomes. And health outcomes are often physical, but are also physiologically and neurological, and therefore relational and spiritual. So it's all connected, right? And 64% of Americans have one or more ACEs. Most of us could identify, therefore, one of these on that tree. It may be hard to see on your screen, but again, you have the slides if you need to go back. Couple more slides, and then we'll pause for just a breath and get some questions if there are any. So trauma-informed spiritual care includes a consciousness about knowing, if you're a care provider, knowing when people are activated in their stress responses. It isn't necessarily to say, oh, you've had trauma, but rather, oh, that's an activated response. It also doesn't necessarily mean I have to do something about that. It means that I am noticing it. I'm bringing consciousness to it. When I'm consciousness of activation of people around me, I'm much more able to calm my own body and be centered in my own self so that I'm able to move forward the way I want to. So we can attune with each other with compassion, right? We grow capacity without helping, assisting, urging, needing something from other people, which is sometimes hard. We want to have collaboration. We want to have support. We want to have the kind of connection. But if someone else can't give that in that moment, how do we manage our own reaction to that? So that's where consciousness comes from. So knowing, first of all, about trauma-informed care, but also being aware of our own reactions. I think I'm going to pause right there, and then we'll move into trauma-conscious spirituality and some of the burnout stuff that we're going to talk about. All righty. Looks like Pastor Joel has a question. Is it also generational passed on to future generations? Absolutely. There is epigenetic research, epigenetics. So you have genes, and then on top of genes, epi. So your genes can actually change generation to generation based on physiological traumatic response. So there's lots of research that actually is showing that in utero, we can change genes and generationally.
With that question, Allie, I was wondering how we can positively change genes epigenetically for positive results. I mean, if people have, and congregations in particular, have gone through collective trauma, and not just COVID, but there's a conflict within the congregation. What I've been seeing is that we continue to have trauma, you know, maybe every couple of years, some crisis will come up and we're not real, and we've even brought in outside groups to work with us.
Sure.
How to positively change the group DNA epigenetically, if you will. I know that's kind of strange, but to move through a trauma so it's not reproducing itself.
Yeah, that's a great question. I work with folks on understanding, first and foremost, your own trauma responses, your own stress responses, your own relational response, and then your organizational response within that. So it's all about your consciousness of how I am part of the system and where my role is in that. And that includes the system itself having self-reflection on their own responses. Yeah. So if collectively it is in stress response, the system is in stress response, then leaders would behoove themselves to provide safety, security, connection, and belonging needs met first, before we move forward in anything else that we may want to do. We need to have our safety systems met collectively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's very helpful, actually. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, great.
I wanted to make a comment. This is Doug O'Krimick here, and I've been in the business a long time and also a spiritual director and a physician. But I would say that it's really hard to define trauma. And as I've done it more, and being a psychiatrist, sometimes DSM, we put people in the categories. Is it post-traumatic stress disorder? Is it dissociative disorder? Is it acute stress, anxiety? And I think, you know, in a way, collectively where we are now, I think collectively we're all feeling the sense of isolation and fear. Yeah. We're afraid, you know, and that's a limbic response, but it's chronic. And so then we can either withdraw or we can get angry with each other, because part of trauma is you can go into a ball and I don't want to see anybody because they're going to hurt me, or you try to fight back. And I think it's complex. And what I've learned and what I'm doing now, even though I'm semi-retired, is that I've done a lot of psychotherapy over the years. And I've recently have done a lot of work in Jungian therapy and dream work. I'm a dream therapist too. And I'm finding that in working with people, and I actually work with a lot of pastors, is at different points in their career and other professionals, is the individual therapy is important, which is what I call inner work, without putting a diagnosis. You know, you're this, you're narcissistic, you're depressed, but you're struggling with spiritual issues, you know, like the dark night of the soul, but you're also struggling with you need spiritual direction. So I usually recommend, in addition, I have a spiritual director myself there for years, that you need both. That ideally it's individual work, you need the spiritual direction. And I think another piece of it, which I think the bishop was talking about, this idea of isolation, is how do you get congregations to work together to be supportive of each other on that spiritual sense and not get caught up? Because a lot of people have ideas, you know, with trauma is, well, just get over it and move on. You know, that's silly that this happened to you. And that is so, you know, you mean well, but you're actually being very abusive that way, because your trauma is your trauma. As you said, it's an experience. Right. I experience trauma differently than you do. I may have had a childhood where my father really traumatized me, and my brother could have seen it as he just walked away and then it didn't bother him. So you can't, this is very soft stuff and there's no absolute answer, but I think the relationship is what heals, you know, a therapist, a spiritual director, and a congregation. And what I sense now, I belong to a small Lutheran church. What I'm feeling, I've only been a member a number of years, is that connection within the congregation isn't there to get people to relate more. And I think there's a real struggle there. And I'm not trying to be critical here, but I see, how do we get our congregation to connect more and get past worrying about, I mean, we have to worry about the budget, we have to worry about this, but how do we've lost our soul, so to speak, to say we're all in this together. We're all broken. We don't know what the heck's going on. And rather than fight with each other, can we kind of come together and feel that, I sense this, if the Holy Spirit, and I think the Holy Spirit works through dreams in my experience, is going to give you some sense of what you have to look at. And I don't want to
100%.
take the
I
oxygen out of the room here, but I just wanted to mention this
love it.
because this is a complex issue. And I appreciate you
Very
handling it.
complex.
And I
Yeah.
think it is, and as pastors and the pastors I've been working with, you have a lot on your plate. I respect all of you so much. It's a lot easier to be a psychiatrist than a pastor, believe me. And it's because you have it all. You have to handle all of this, and the congregation expects you to fix it. Or give me give me something from the Bible to help. And that can be helpful. What we learn in spiritual direction is you have to work from within. You're going to heal from within. And I think that's what Jesus talked about. It's not something.
Thank you, Douglas. And thank you for also your own caregiving. I mean, I think that you're spot on about the importance of both the inner work as well as spiritual work, because like I mentioned before about our activation is physiological, but our higher level brain system needs to be consciously activated in order for us to reconnect. So if we are in dream circles or in spiritual direction, we are consciously attempting to tell our bodies that we're in a safety system. So it does require effort. And I think that we live in a society and a culture where we want fast results, and we want to be like, oh, I feel better and it's all better. I see lots of questions popping in.
Yeah, there's some good questions in the chat, Allie. Yeah.
Walk through some.
Pastor Terry's was one of the first ones in about disassociation. Pastor Terry, do you want to ask that, or do you want us to just take that right from the chat?
What they might mean when they say they've been dissociating.
You can take that right from the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that would probably require some assessment on from a therapist, from a licensed therapist, as to what dissociation, what it's doing. Dissociation, just as it's a protective response. Okay, for us to dissociate, to not remember something, like a lot of people have had difficult childhoods. Most of them say, like, I don't remember big swaths of time. And that is not to say like, oh, you should be remembering it. It's like, thank you, body and brain, for protecting me. I needed that in a time where I didn't have my safety systems met. So, dissociation is just another way our bodies and brains cope with something that's overwhelming of the nervous system, overwhelming of our capacity to cope with it in the moment. So it does require some assessment. I would say, if you do see someone who's constantly dissociating, or say that they're suffering, but with their dissociation, that they can't be present, they have difficulty being present, that is something to be aware of. That, okay, if it's becoming a problem and we can't be relational, obviously that's not living in a way that we want to usually. So
I guess my question is, what a little bit of information as to what that experience is like for them. Like someone has told me recently, I've been disassociating, so I'm not comfortable driving. Does it mean they're like zoning out? Does it mean, it seems like it's more than simple loss of memory of an event?
It could mean a lot of things. That's why I recommended perhaps getting assessed from a therapist as to what that looks like for them. In general, dissociation is a detachment from feelings and detachment from reality sometimes. So that there is this feeling of altered way of experiencing life, or kind of just being floaty. Again, that's a trauma response that not necessarily that I'm also, the way I'm saying that just makes me think of people, like why people seek substance use. It's a way to artificially impose a dissociated response because our situation is too much for us to handle.
Can I speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, yeah, I'll let you go. I'd like to make a point too. I don't want to take up all the conversation here. Go ahead, Dixie.
Yes, Pastor Terry, as a child at 13, my father died by suicide. And my mother, her statement was, he chose to end his life. We are moving on. And we never talked about it. And I can tell you, as I look back now, and years later, I ended up going through therapy and I take medication, but I distinctly remember as a child spending a lot of time in my bedroom listening to music. And I do believe that was I was disassociating, I wasn't dealing with that traumatic event. And I think that everyone who disassociates will have different ways of disassociating, whether it be, okay, I'm not going to leave my house, or I'm going to drink, or I'm going to take drugs so I don't have to deal with this. I don't want to call it a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
But it somewhat is, you
Yes.
need to spend that time away from that trauma to just,
Yep.
yeah.
Dixie, thank you
Yeah.
for being vulnerable there. I mean, we don't,
Sure.
Yeah.
heart
Could
goes
I-
out to you and your loss. One of the things I wanted to say is it is a coping, and it's a legitimate coping strategy because it's our reaction. We cannot judge our reactions. Just as we can't judge us stepping back from that car, cutting us off, we can't judge that. Our bodies do this naturally. When it becomes a problem is when it affects our relationship. It becomes cycles out of our own control. That is when it becomes a problem. When our family is like, I can't access you, I want to love you, that's when it becomes a problem. So yeah, I did want to just affirm that dissociation is legitimate. It's absolutely one of those things we as therapists want to normalize in our experience.
Can I mention one thing though about dissociation? I think for Pastor Terry, if you're seeing someone who's dissociating, I think they need to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. The reason I say that, they need therapy too, because dissociation in my book with PTSD, these people tend to have severe trauma usually from their childhood. And the other part of dissociation is sometimes they can get so dissociative, they can have another personality. There's a whole concept of multiple. I don't want to get into that. But to me, in my experience, dissociation is a severe symptom of what's going on. Because when you dissociate, when your husband gets mad at you, that's way out of proportion. I mean, that's not necessarily abuse, or because you had a flashback of something. And so I think for all the pastors here, I think it's important if you have people dissociating, they need to be evaluated by a therapist possibly, because not to get too academic here, sometimes people who dissociate have a seizure disorder or they have some kind of medical problem going on. And sometimes we assume something. And so I say, as a pastor, to be able to say, I think you need to see someone, they may listen to you,
Yeah, that's great. That's a really good, important point. Dissociation, people may term it that, but you won't know until you get evaluated and assessed clinically. Let's move to the next part of my presentation. Do you want to say a few more words on spiritual care and trauma-informed spiritual care, as well as burnout prevention and secondary stress, right? This is what pastors often go to. And if I don't get to all the questions, I think at the end, we'll definitely get the maybe emails from folks or ways that I can answer them on email or some way to connect to folks. Okay. Does that work, Charlie?
Yeah, that's great. We can save these questions from the chat and we'll make sure that they're passed along.
Right.
Yep.
Beautiful. So moving into the consciousness part that I mentioned before, spirituality is the higher level brain structures that getting online helps us cope with stress, chronic stress. It helps us actually heal from trauma. It does. What it looks like can be a lot of things, and these are just some. Openness to experience. Okay, if you think about when you're in high stress situations or in traumatic response, you're not open, right? We're like, whoop, narrow-minded, for a good reason, right? So trauma conscious spirituality has us open up to experience. It's also non-judgmental in its support. It welcomes all parts of ourselves, even kind of the shadows and the itchy parts that don't feel that great. Trauma conscious spirituality looks like curiosity. I wonder if, what if? Trauma conscious spirituality is creating physically and emotionally safe spaces. Of course, safety is defined just like trauma is based on your own experience, but the attempt to create physically and emotionally safe spaces. Trauma consciousness looks like attunement and mirroring. So when I attune myself emotionally to what I hear, if you're sad, I don't look happy, right? We're on the same level, mirroring each other. It's a relational response. Trauma conscious spirituality provides voice and choice. Going back to what I mentioned about religious trauma, those spaces were not trauma informed because they took away people's ability to have choice, agency, and voice in that system. And trauma conscious spirituality is boundaried. This is what we do here. This is what we do not do here. And the door is like welcoming in and out of that. But this is what we do here. So here's our routine, here's our ritual. We start, we end. We light the candles, we blow out the candles, right? So going back to dissociation as a stress response, stress is a natural protective response. Trauma is as well, like our traumatic reactions, and they can be contagious. So that's why it's important to know this stuff when we work in community, is that we bring attention to our own reactions. So chronic stress can look like symptoms of trauma. We can look, the zoning out on our phones and stuff, that can look like dissociation and trauma response. And sometimes it's just an overwhelmed nervous system from being so stressed every day and having no outlets for it. All of us have gotten that place, right? So spiritual caregivers, pastors, ministers, they can approach chronic stress and trauma in this way by simply engaging in systems and with people who have unattended trauma and unhealed trauma. So caregiving fatigue can be a result. Caregiving fatigue often looks like just, I'm done, like just feeling like I'm done. I'm sure a lot of moms and parents there can be like, I felt that, it's exhaustion, right? Secondary stress and trauma, this goes down to a little bit of that attunement mirroring. If we see day in, day out, people in stress response and trauma response coming to us, and we're attuning to that and not taking care of our nervous system after, our nervous system is going to be frayed and it's going to have secondary stress. We're going to be walking around with our own activation, simply sitting with folks. Chaplains see this as well. Over time, that can look like burnout. That can look like, emotional exhaustion, feeling like you're, checked out with folks, having a hard time accessing the joy in the work and the joy in the call, right? Moral injury is another subset. This is for chaplains as well, especially when I have to be in a situation where it does not align with my morals and values. That can cause, they call it moral injury, but it's a trauma response. It's coming back to self and saying, I cannot connect what I had to do with who I am. And sometimes we're stuck in situations when we're spiritual leaders, and where we have to do the hard thing and we're really kind of in conflict. So these are symptoms of burnout: reduced productivity, increased feelings of irritability. So one of the things I did want to touch on is all of this stress response, trauma response, burnout, all of it in ministry can be improved and helped through fostering resiliency. So one of the things we talked about was complex trauma. So people who have had long-term history, especially childhood, of trauma, their resiliency systems have reduced. So if you've had repeated exposure, your ability to access your ability to change and shift and be flexible has reduced down. Understand, like, we have to do that because our stress response narrows our viewpoint. Remember, it reduces our openness to experience to a very black and white, this is the way forward kind of way. I think it goes to what I think Pastor Terry was saying about fear. Fear is another kind of stress response. It's a way to narrow our viewpoint cognitively so that it reduces our decision making down to a more palatable size. If we are in stress response and we have 80 different decisions, it's hard to choose. But fear, stress response makes it whoop. All we got is this and that. What do you think? And it's much easier to choose. So, we have to know that as humans, that isn't necessarily the healthiest way to go about being in community where there's, all different types of perspectives. Sometimes it is as easy as black and white, but usually isn't. So resiliency is about rebounding from stress and trauma and returning back to your normal state of being. Normal being what I said before, relaxation response, calm, centered, connected to yourself with a capital S. Me, Allie, standing right here. Me. So resiliency looks like mental wellness strategies, self-care, community support. It has to be connected to systems and what's the environment around us. It must be. Resiliency is always related, and burnout prevention is always related to what's around us. For all the reasons I talked about before, about how we are relational. And it also is connected to meaning making and purpose. So that's why it's really particularly difficult for those of us in ministry professions where we get detached from our call. And it's so distressing because we're feeling so burned out and we want to access that, but it's really difficult. We're feeling dissociated, disconnected from it. So spiritual resiliency, rand.org has great coping on their website on spiritual coping, but they talk about the grounding in your faith and your spirituality, your personal religious spiritual practices. Those can be very centering and, again, calming for the nervous system, calming for all the reasons we talked about for the trauma response. So this is a model I saw online on 7 types of rest. Of course, there's probably different types. It's just one way of visualizing it. But maybe this can give you, a chance to see and to notice where am I taking care of my needs in this? Maybe I'm getting a lot of physical rest. I'm getting my 8-9 hours. But when is the last time I felt creative? Maybe mental rest can look like taking time off from reading and instead watching the birds out back or something. Sensory rest can, noticing if you're someone that gets sensory overload. People who are neurodivergent specifically this is a big one. So the necessary need to understand our sensory needs. And some of them is input from the outside. And we're on Zoom, so we're not like shaking each other's hand physically, we're not doing the physical touch stuff that we as humans have been doing the entire humanity. So where do we get that? And so I would encourage you to look at this because, just like I said, it's not necessarily your fault and you need to get out of your own stress, but there's layers to it. Where can I have input from the external world? Where can I have my emotional needs shored up? Where's my support system? What's the health of that? Yeah. I'm just checking the time. Good, we're good on time. So just as a brief check-in, if you have like a pencil or paper, I'm just going to pause and allow you to go back to that original question, that original invitation to check in with your body. Hey, talking about this, hearing Allie talk about this has really stressed me out, oh my gosh, maybe taking a moment to see where you're at with this. And maybe you don't feel stressed, who knows? Just give yourself this time. I invite you. You can write. Some folks really like writing responses. So that's why I have some prompts. What's been coming up for me? Name some sensations, maybe. Some of us get stress in our neck. When I talk about stress or think about it, I feel like my neck, something like that. So all of that is invited for you to just notice. Just notice, okay? Noticing itself can help reduce its sensation. It can help you relax. So just going to give you just a minute or so for all of you. Your body needs to move. I'm going to drink my tea here. Maybe you need to stand up. Just check in. And then we'll come back to the circle. So I'm just going to open it up to a few more questions. I think we'll probably just, answer questions till the end here. At the end, I'm going to actually offer a few practices for your own sort of calming, taking care of your nervous system. So we'll do that right at the end. But till that, let's go back to these questions that we were. Let's see here. Where do we end there, Charlie?
We had a question about how leaders and congregations, church staff can become educated to help folks who are dealing with trauma. And I think, we're setting up an opportunity like that. And today is part of the launch of that. I don't know if you want to say a word about that or not, Allie.
Yeah, no, I've been invited to work a little bit more closely with the Lower Susquehanna Synod in connecting you all to trauma-informed care. So, my background is psychotherapy, and I do layer my work in spiritual direction. I'm not a pastor, but I work with a lot of them. So I can speak in my own background and my own work with the importance of this stuff. And so we'll be possibly, it's all in the works as to what that will look like, but we'll be offering more information and support around developing trauma informed care and trauma consciousness in spiritual care and religious faith-based community. You can also look at my website too, and you can see more about what I do if you're curious. If there's a role for a person, so Susan asks, is there a role for a person who has experienced a type of trauma such as the handicapped child in helping and supporting others in this situation without being a trained professional, but simply as a person who gets it? Yeah, I mean, I going back to what I mentioned before about mirroring and attunement, the best healers are the ones who went through what they went through. I mean, I think most people can understand authenticity right away. And so if you have had your own healing journey, and feel like that's an invitation for you, I think that's a great opening for ministry. I think that's a great opening for connection.
I found that once I sort of admitted what I went through in terms of my own depression and, close to suicide, but fortunately I got the help I needed. But once I came forth and started being honest with folks about my depression and things like that, I found that people came to me and said, gosh, it's nice to know that someone else feels that way sometimes. It's just, as a person who gets it, you can relate to those people and they find comfort in knowing that they're not alone.
100%.
I think there's a big comfort there to know that you're not alone in those struggles sometimes.
We can't do this healing work alone. We're meant to do this in community, and spiritual communities and faith-based communities are primed places. That's why I touched on, religious and spiritual trauma. People go into spiritual and faith communities often seeking validation and support based on their own past histories. And therefore, they can be more vulnerable to impressions and expectations. And so it is something to be aware of, to know, like, we in faith-based communities, I believe, must be trauma-informed because we have an obligation not to do harm for those who are seeking support and validation in those spaces and healing in those spaces. Again, in a boundaried way. This is what we do, and this is where we refer out. This is what we do, this is what we don't do. I think Deacon Ellen Doherty, I don't know if you want to share on that, but she says, we go through events, not jump over events like water puddles. And I think that's a beautiful way of saying, like, there can be a tendency when it's difficult stuff to bypass it, to jump over, the hard stuff, especially if we aren't ready for it. If we've, again, no blame, like we're just stretched thin. We've had too much, we've been through enough, like we're not there, we can't do it. Again, that's what's so great about having healthy trauma-informed communities, is that we can actually foster supports within that, where there are people who are able to sit, so that we can walk through the mud puddle together and get on the other side of that.
Yeah, this is Ellen Dowdy. I'm the one.
Hi.
I work as a chaplain, and I'm at my third location, which is the closest one to home. But the first location was a psych hospital. And I hear it even at the other hospitals that, they're told they have to just get over it, go through it. And I said, you're not jumping over it. You have to work through everything. And I'm here to help you with that. Right. So, yeah, that's why I use that phrase a lot. And then people because I'm a visual person, and I think it gives a visual image for people to see. And then they're like, oh. But
yes, and it's also what I love about that, going back to that slide about trauma-informed spirituality, you're modeling openness to experience. Mm-hmm. You're modeling, you are that you're open to their ability to reframe it the way they want to. to not be like, to voice and choice, to not be like, this is what you have to do. We have to do it this way, so that they're able to kind of become accepting of their experience. You know, when we aren't able to when we jump over that puddle, we also don't learn the lesson of the puddle. And you know, that's unfortunate. So thanks for your experience.
So the keynote speaker today was talking about theology of accompaniment. So maybe we can put theology of accompaniment and the trauma work that you're doing, Allie, together with the work of our synod a little bit too.
Absolutely.
It sounds like accompaniment is a huge part of helping people with trauma, especially those that have gone through a similar trauma.
Yes. Yeah, how can we accompany in a safe, boundaried, secure way that mirrors the model of trauma-informed care, openness, of non-judgmental support? Yeah. Rockwell says, if trauma is experience-based, then trauma then is part of the person's story. It seems to me that pastoral care in relation to trauma means bringing God's story into the mix to help the traumatized person begin to reinterpret the meaning, be renewed by the transforming of your mind. Am I on the right track? Yeah, in pastoral care, absolutely. Again, this is what we do, this is what we don't do. If you come into pastoral care, we're going to talk about scripture as it relates to the ability to hold our difficult times together. Is that okay with you? We're going to talk about, you know, so it provides a model for the meaning making of the difficult times. And, you know, again, with the invitation of, does that resonate with you? Because everyone's background's different, everyone's trauma is different, you know, and we want to provide voice and choice within that. Susan Bianchi, I'm sorry if I messed up your last name. And people with a cognitive disability, congenital or from trauma, where higher brain functions are missing or limited, how do we support that person in healing and functional? Yeah, I mean, that's beyond the scope of what we're sharing today, Susan. I mean, if you do want to talk a little bit more, I'm always be happy to chat on email more on what you're dealing with there. But again, both having resources within your organization, but also referring obviously to medical providers or therapeutic providers that can help with those things, and being kind of the thread between the two. When we refer out, we don't say bye, we say, hey, how's it going in that, you know, and we provide that relational connection.
Allie, I just wanted to mention, I really appreciate you opening this up about trauma, because it is kind of the education piece is so important. And I see this so important for churches, and like we were talking about the integration of counseling and spiritual direction, and trying to see how our spiritual selves can help people relationally and being a good listener. But I think this is a topic that you could spend a whole day on. So thank you so much for all your good points that you made.
Oh, thanks, Douglas. I appreciate the feedback. And it's a passion of mine, if that's not obvious. And so I'm excited to work in any capacity that I can with the LSS. And also,
if I can be a help, this is kind of my passion now. I'm trying to integrate from my career and trying to see how I fit in with this. But I do see there's so much work to be done of taking away the diagnosis and just being there with people. And even I'll just say too, being a geriatric psych person over the years, you can help people with cognitive functions, because I've worked with them in the sense of you bring the family and you can have a session with both and just listen and help them. And just because they're forgetful doesn't mean you can't offer hope and offer helping them through scripture, through contemplative prayer, whatever. And I think you can help everyone by just listening and not fixing. And I've learned that here. Our listening skills and being a present can do so much. That to me is humility from my perspective. So again,
100%.
yeah, thank you again.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I did notice that Maureen had her hand up at one point. Maureen, I
Okay,
don't know if
great.
you wanted to ask a question or not, if you had something you wanted to pose. I know that there's one or two more questions in the chat, but
Sure. Hit the wrong button, Maureen. You and me both. Done it before.
So I noticed a question there in the chat from Russell Walkwell, and
Oh, can people keep their, yeah, I see that too.
they
Thanks.
absolutely can keep their trauma hidden. I did it for a long time, but it wasn't until I, went through therapy that I think I've, 25 years after the fact, grieved my father's death. But, I went to my pastor because I had really reached the end of my rope. And thankfully, he recognized that while he prayed with me, he said, please seek some help. I mean, he recognized that,
Sure.
He couldn't just say, hey, God loves you and you're good to go,
Yeah.
And so I got the professional help I needed. But I do think that that's one important thing for, at least in my experience, for the pastor to recognize that, yes, they can help them with that spiritual side of what they might be feeling, but there are times when a professional therapist is needed,
Right. Absolutely, Dixie. Yep. Absolutely. And people can and should hold their trauma in the way they need to. The question here, Russell says, can people keep their trauma hidden and how might that manifest? Just similar to what I said about dissociation, it's a coping response. Same with holding back and saying not ready to talk, that you cannot force anyone. If you do, that is not trauma-informed care, obviously. So we need to be very respectful of the fact people have their own stories and approach that very tenderly of even just the invitational language around understand that we all have our tender stories. That's sort of how I think about it. It doesn't mean like everyone has trauma. We don't need to even point that out. It's as ministers or pastors, because he mentioned, do we assume people really have experienced trauma and how may that be reflected in preaching? I think we should assume that everyone has their tender stories. And how do we hold those very tenderly and cautiously and close to us and love them as ourselves? And then slowly, if we feel invited, how do we heal those tender stories within us in a way that is open to experience and open to our concept of spirituality, and they can be very layered, because a lot of people can feel shame associated with their trauma histories and feel like they're bad and hold it back because they don't want to show it because they feel bad. So there's really a necessary posture as a spiritual care provider towards tenderness and humility. And we don't know ever the whole story of anyone, ever. Taken from someone who does this full time. I mean, we just don't know it. So we need to be very cautious and tender around that. But also, accepting and non-judgmental in our ability to connect. So I hope that shares a little bit for you, Russell, in that question. Any other questions?
Allie, I just wanted to just say a quick word of thanks before we get too late here, that on behalf of our staff and our team for contributing to this day and being a part of this conversation with us this day, and your guidance and leadership, and also for the vulnerability of those who ask questions and were willing to kind of share a bit. And I just want to give you a chance to have any concluding thoughts you might have as we close out this morning's dialogue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate you too. And helping create this space. So, you know, I was going to end just sort of with some strategies that we can use to orient ourselves to our bodies in a nervous system way. And I'm going to actually give you 3 options. So you can do this on your own time. You can do this now with me. But these are things that I do. These are things I teach, you know, with folks. The first is an in-breath. So if you have asthma or something, just, you know, if you have issues with breathing, just take it or leave it. So we take our nice deep belly breath and then we hold. So we bring it in as deep as we can, and then we hold it. And then we breathe in a little bit more at the top. And then we exhale out as long as you can. So this is a nice cleansing breath, and you can actually use scripture, holy words, anything you can, Holy Spirit as part of your process here. The second one is massaging your jaw and your 10 temples. So this is like a self-touch. This is a grounding kind of way to get ourselves back. And again, frontal lobe, this is where we connect with God. So I always kind of like, hey, welcome back to my senses. And then finally, the last one is self-hugging, because I think someone even said something about a hug. Give yourself a hug. You know, this actually to your brain, I mean, it may in your mind be like, oh, this is silly. Your brain doesn't know the difference between yourself hugging or someone else. It's just the same. So it's one way to kind of reconnect ourselves back to our bodies, our relaxation response, our ability to be present. So I hope that's helpful. You know, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I really am very honored. And if anyone needs to email me more questions, I'm at rootgrowthrive@gmail.com. Anything else that pops up, I can be of value to you and what you do. I'd be happy to. So,
Yeah. Thanks again. I do want to encourage folks after a short break here. We're going to resume with some closing comments from the bishop at 11:45 on our main Zoom link that we were using earlier this morning. And that would be a chance to reconnect with the whole body and to be part of a closing prayer as well. So thanks again, Allie. We really appreciate your time and all your work this day.
yes. Blessings, everyone. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.